2022 Highway Code versus 1931 Highway Code. 7 hard-to-believe facts.
The new Highway Code for 2022 is about to come out in the UK, and there's loads of talk in the media about the revisions, especially when it comes to pedestrians and cyclists.
But have you ever wondered when the very first Highway Code was introduced and produced, and how much you'd have to pay today in 2022 to buy an original 1931 copy?
Well, wonder no more. I'm going to give you some interesting and hard to believe facts about the early days of the Highway Code. And as you probably guessed, the very first Highway Code was produced in Britain in 1931. And if you've got one of these early books at home, or you see one out whilst antique hunting, I'll tell you just how much it's worth today in 2022. So in 1931, the Highway Code cost just 1 penny, which is probably around £1 today, and it was a bestseller. So hard to believe fact number 1 is this: the Highway Code still is a bestseller. Each year, it's at the top of the list of bestsellers. Hard to believe fact number 2. When the first book was launched in 1931 in Britain, there were just over 2 million cars on the roads, which actually to me sounds like quite a lot. But when you compare that figure to the amount of cars on the road today in 2022, it's 32.5 million. So in 1931, just over 2 million. Today in 2022, 32.5 million cars on the road. So 15 times more cars today in 2022 than there was in 1931. So the roads back then in the early 30s were remarkably quiet. But so was the country in that regard.
Well, to get that into some sort of perspective, the population of Great Britain in 1931 was around 40 million. Today, in 2022, it's around 67 million.
But back to the very first Highway Code, and hard to believe fact number 3. Even though there weren't that many cars on the roads back in 1931, road deaths stood at around 7,000 per year, compared to around 1,800 today. So in 1931, there was less than 10% of the cars on the roads, but the road deaths were more than 3 times what they are today. So it was far more dangerous to be on the roads in 1931 than it is today in 2022. There was just lots of accidents, and that's partly down to the driving test of the day. And here's hard to believe fact number 4.
There was no driving test. They didn't exist. If you could afford to buy a car, you bought it, you jumped in and you drove your car. No test. Compulsory driving tests were not introduced until 1935. So as you can imagine, in 1931, there was an awful lot of very bad drivers and a serious shortage of police patrol vehicles on the roads, and a very lax attitude when it came to drink driving.
Which brings me on to hard to believe fact number 5. In 1931, it was strictly speaking illegal to be in charge of any machinery, a tractor, farm machinery, or a car for that matter, whilst under the influence of alcohol. But there was no real drink driving test, no set limit as to how much you could drink, or in fact shouldn't drink for that matter, and it was perfectly normal to go to the pub, drink as much as you like, stumble into car and drive yourself home.
No breathalyzers, they weren't introduced until the 1960s.
And so if you were unfortunate enough to be pulled over by the police, which would be highly unlikely, and you were a bit drunk, or obviously very drunk, it was at the discretion of the police officer to determine whether or not you were able to drive home. Most people would be simply advised to take it easy and be on their way. Hard to believe fact Number 6. In 1931, there were no speed limits on the roads at all. You could go as fast as you liked or as fast as your car allowed. And on that point, as an example, an Austin 7, brand new in 1931 in tip-top condition, could possibly, if you were lucky, get up to 60 miles an hour on the right road, maybe with a bit of a hill. But it would be shaking and rattling itself to bits. And you'd need a lot of road if you needed to come to a sudden stop. Brakes were horrifying. You'd also need a good long straight road to get up to that speed, because it might take a minute or more of foot to the floor to hit 60 miles an hour.
The book has a number of recommended hand signals to use whilst driving. Now, these hand signals are not a bit like the kind of hand signals we're used to in 2022.
Here's some examples. It looks like driving in 1931 was just much simpler. Simpler times, but far more dangerous.
The original Highway Code book of 1931 contained only 18 pages compared to today, 2022, of at least 150 pages. And there will be nowhere in today's Highway Code will you see commercial adverts. Well, the same rules and regulations didn't apply to 1931. Check these out. Okay, before I tell you how much you're going to have to pay for an original 1931 Highway Code book, let me give you hard to believe, and it's the final hard to believe fact number 7. And it's this. It says in the 1931 edition of the Highway Code that if you come behind a slow moving vehicle and you want to overtake, and of course, if it's safe to do so, the road is clear, whilst you're overtaking, as a matter of courtesy, let the slow moving vehicle in front know that you're coming around his outside edge by blowing your horn.
And so how much can you buy a 1931 original Highway Code for? Well, it makes fascinating reading, a real trip back to the early days of motoring, but not quite as much as you might be thinking. It was about £1 in its day, and you can easily pick one up today online for £10. Happy motoring!